So this is video number 2 in this little series, connecting to lostness. In the previous one I read out the poem, and I'm going to stay with that theme and expand a little. What we touched on there was this lostness, and in a sense about letting yourself be found in the moment in your experience. But of course it's not as simple as that. We've all learned to brace ourselves, defend ourselves against uncertainty, and usefully so. It's been very important for us to do that. Of course, what we discover as we enter into shiatsu and enter into the valuable territory of letting an event, the contact with the client in this instance, letting the event be actually novel. How do we allow a genuinely novel event? And what strategies do we utilize that get in the way of a genuinely novel and intimate experience? Now, the word vulnerability is an important one here. How do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable? When we're talking about, as in the poem, let it find you, or let the person find you, we're referring to some degree to a kind of vulnerability, an undefendedness. And but I want to be really specific about an understanding of vulnerability here, because I think it's poorly understood. It's become a bit of a buzzword in the sort of therapy world and shiatsu world and so on. And I think it's really poorly understood. Let me tell you what I think the misconception is first, and give you a different understanding, and I'll tie that back into what I mean by lost and how we can change our relationship with this. So by and large, the term vulnerable, and it's been popularised by people like Brené Brown. She's done some good stuff and so on. By all means, check her work out if you're interested. She's been popularising the idea of vulnerability and attempting to take some of the shame off, and not just have vulnerability associated with feeling weak or inadequate in some way and so on. But the trouble is, when vulnerability starts to be talked of in that way, it again becomes abstracted as a certain thing. And the way it's loosely being held, I think, in common parlance, is that it's to be somewhat tender, undefended, sort of wobbly, unguarded territory. And, you know, I think there's some value to understanding it that way. However, what we discover when we work therapeutically with people is they get to learn to do vulnerability, to be tearful, and to talk about the what isn't usually talked about in normal conversations and so on. How to explain this? So, but actually, what's actually vulnerable in the moment is what's novel. So, for example, for someone who's been brought up in a family in which tearfulness and sadness are quite acceptable, but say anger, confrontation, powerful assertiveness are not welcome, they can quite comfortably go into a tearful, apparently undefended position, and nothing changes. For them, what's vulnerable is to step into something fierce or angry or assertive. So you start to see that vulnerability doesn't have a specific quality. It is completely unique and relates more to the relational situation about what are we vulnerable to, And I think it's really useful to think about vulnerability not as vulnerability, this is vulnerability, but what are we vulnerable to? And one of the most important qualities that seems to come in terms of how we defend ourselves is areas where we feel vulnerable to rejection. What do we imagine is rejectable about us, and what will get us rejected? And human beings are very savvy at attempting to work that out and preempt it. How do I reduce my risks of rejection? And of course, depending on people's family backgrounds and their systems and so on, they've worked out different ways of how to ensure they don't get rejected. Of course, the problem is you can never actually know, because you don't know what someone else's preferences are. Although human beings seem to be persistently preoccupied with this particular game, which is a bit of a muddle. Now, where that takes us back to in terms of us as practitioners, because our bodies are responding to another person's body actually in a spontaneous and immediate way, our job is to pay attention to that. It's very interesting. How does my body respond emotionally to someone else? I might be seeing one thing. I might be seeing a very competent, poised, articulate person. When I touch their body, I can feel a sudden rush of sadness, or a sudden paralysis of fear. And our bodies are superb at tuning into the more primitive aspects of another person. That's where that language exists. Carl Jung said, I'm sick of the conversation about where the unconscious is. The unconscious is in the body. So this puts us in a very privileged position in terms of shiatsu practitioners. But it does mean we are confronted with this process of revealing ourselves and entering into, as unguarded as possible, the novelty of the situation. Now, what goes alongside that is, but you have certain defences. They exist and you need them, and I don't mean to shame them or make them wrong, but it is important to start bringing them into awareness and becoming into dialogue around those things. So we've touched on these a little bit in the class. I'm going to touch on again here, and it's important for us as practitioners to get more versed in what are my defences, what are the ways in which I apprehend the situation, and how can I support and empower myself to bring more of myself, and increasingly bring more of myself. I mean, of course, this does not only apply to shiatsu, but of course into life, because where we attempt to control, we surrender some power and liveliness and aliveness of the situation. And the invitation on this course, of course, is find power. And by power in this instance, I refer to the power to step into the aliveness of the situation, to be enabled to reveal ourselves. I'm using that power in that context, rather than the popular notion at the moment is the power over. I'm talking about the power to. I'm just going to do a little recap of some of the defences that we've talked about in the class, and because these are some of the ways in which the strategies we will use to attempt to control what is a new situation. And I'm going to add another one that we might have touched on, but we have confluence, egotism, projection, retroflexion, introjection, and I'm going to add deflection. All slightly complicated words. So what qualities enable a novel, lively, new situation? Well, firstly, there needs to be difference. You're two different people. You're encountering difference. you're going to see them differently than they see themselves. And that's vital part, of course, it's a vital part of yin and yang, is the liveliness of difference. That the S shape between yin and yang is the point of most tension, and it's the point of most aliveness and contrast. And that difference is going to be there between you and your client. Confluence is an attempt to reduce the tensions of difference by merging, becoming boundaryless and merging into the client. And this is one of the defenses we're most prone to as shiatsu practitioners, because we're invested in touch and in closeness and intimacy. So a kind of merging seems like an attractive and good thing to do, but not when you lose yourself, not when you lose yourself in the other. You know, there's a really interesting factor environmentally, that it's where two contrasting landscapes meet that you get most biodiversity. When you allow difference to be there between you and your client in the contact, you feel the contrast of your touch. You're touching, you're feeling what you're with, and you're in contact with who you're with, and you're aware and you're able to hold what they're with, and that difference exists as a lively contrast. Something powerful can happen. And confluence is an attempt to manage and typically control or lessen the anxiety that's provoked by difference. Next is egotism. Egotism, again, it's not necessarily a useful phrase because it gets conflated with egoism. Egotism relates here to a type of control in which we don't fully surrender to the spontaneity of a situation, and we manage control through a kind of voyeuristic self-interest by self-monitoring. In my experience, this self-monitoring is a kind of hypervigilance. When we've been criticised or when we've been shamed, we sometimes learn to monitor ourselves to make sure we don't step out of line again. And the chief cost of that is of spontaneity, of letting ourselves act spontaneously. We second guess what other people are thinking, we rehearse what we're going to say, we even rehearse what we're going to do, and we can be very prone to sticking with routines that worked. Because the risks of something new happening could be quite devastating in terms of being shamed, humiliated, ridiculed, or just exposed. So egotism is a kind of self-monitoring that again denies the spontaneity of the actual event. Now, the next one, projection, is a much more well-known phrase. Seeing on the outside what's really on the inside is a simple way of seeing it. And projection has a habit of, I think, of probably influencing all the other defenses or modifications to contact that I'm talking about here. In projection, one of the most common, put it this way, in terms of shiatsu, is we have somewhat disconnected from a place of our own vulnerability, and I mean vulnerability in the new definition. Okay, so a part of our shadow self might be our anger, it might be our rage, it might be our violence, it might be our grief, it might be our tenderness, sexuality, sensuality, whatever that might be. But we have somewhat disconnected from a vulnerable part of ourselves, and the way we get back into contact with a disconnected part of ourselves is we project it onto others and we encounter it out in the world. And it's very easy to begin to project vulnerability onto clients, and when we do that, we miss them and we miss ourselves. One of the most common issues with projecting our vulnerability, for example our neglected selves, onto another, is we continue to neglect ourselves and we miss the other person. And of course this can happen the other way. We can project power an invulnerability onto other people, particularly onto teachers, bosses, authority figures, and so on. And then you lose contact with your own potency, and so on. So projection's a very common one here. Yes, there's more I could say about that, but I'll pause that for the moment. Then we have retroflexion, which means to turn back against, turn back inside, or turn back against. It often means to do to oneself what you want to do to another. The example I've given about this before is, say you have something biting to say to another person, they've angered you and you have something biting to say. Instead of saying that, you bite your own lip and you internalize. So a common one, for example, with this is anger. We fear anger will get us rejected, or even more rejection than we've encountered, and so we bite our lip and we direct the anger inward as a form of self-attack or criticism instead of to the other. But of course it can also happen in terms of affection. When we want to reach out and be affectionate to another, instead we stroke our own hand or we caress our own face when it's another person's face that we want to caress. Of course, in these terms, a more known form of retroflexion is masturbation. It's doing to oneself what we want to be doing with another. And of course, there's a good deal of control invested in this. We reduce the likelihood of rejection, but of course we fundamentally reduce the possibility of much more lively, growthful and nourishing contact. How this shows up in terms of, it shows up more, I suppose, as an attitude in relation to our clients. But for example, a retroflexion might show up in terms of your attitude with the client, in terms of if you start noticing yourself being rejecting or critical of yourself, you might find that you're retroflecting a challenge that you might want to be expressing to them. That's one example of it. And the next one is introjection. Introjection is can be a bit of a complicated idea, and it needs a little bit of context. One image for how we grow as beings in the world is that we're encountering life and events and experiences, and we might say we're ingesting and digesting our experiences in the world. And that we make, you are what you eat, that we make ourselves, we build ourselves as a human being as we encounter the world and chew it up and digest it, which is a somewhat aggressive process. Chewing, digesting, ingesting, and that aggression is a very important part of both desiring and consuming life and bringing it into us and making it ours. The chewing process enables us to integrate life into ourselves. Now, if you encounter, especially as a child, powerful people, parents, siblings, schools, what have you, you might find yourself exposed to ideas, beliefs, patterns of behavior that you don't have time or energy or enough power to fully digest and consume and make yours. You swallow it whole, and that's when you introject it. Now, when you introject something, you haven't made it yours. You haven't given it full discernment of, is this what I believe? Is this really my way of living? Is this my relationship with it? And introjects have a habit of living inside you as shoulds, manifesting through guilt and shame. So if you introjected, teachings from, say, the Christian church, you might introject a quality of turn the other cheek. And you're not really living that out as a fully digested, inhabited attitude that you've chosen. You're adopting that as a should. I should turn the other cheek, which of course leaves you vulnerable in all sorts of situations. I should be kind. I should be good. I should not be aggressive. I should not compete. I should not want. I should not express my needs. To express my needs is to be needy, and I should not be needy. These are all examples of introjects that therefore through these shoulds form a kind of guilt that we're then controlled by. and we lose contact with what we actually want and what we actually desire. So common ones that you get on a very simple level, let alone the childhood ones, but just even from you introject things when you're learning something new. So you'll have introjected things from the shiatsu course. A common one is people start to introject the idea that they should be feeling balanced and calm for their shiatsu. I should be feeling peaceful, are really common ones, which are extremely bullying and dominating notions that negate our actual experience. So these are really common. And finally, the other one is deflection, deflecting away from areas that feel tense. And this is again a common one in terms of shiatsu, is instead of going to the area that feels more lively and perhaps more challenging, we deflect into more familiar territory. And so we go to the sort of routine that we feel more comfortable with, or that we know the client likes. Of course, if you're too invested in what the client likes, you're going to miss the transformative potential of the actual touch, because nothing lives in honey, as I'm very familiar with saying. Nothing lives in honey. You can't just stay with what's liked and stay away from the uncomfortable territory. So there's a little overview of some of the, and recap of some of the defenses we've touched on before. And I'm saying these in the context of how do we prevent ourselves entering into a novel situation, and what strategies do we adapt and adopt to prevent the novelty of an immediate situation. And I hope you can bring these into awareness through conversation, through dialogue with each other. And of course, this is all things you can bring back to our next online tutorial. Okay, I hope to see you soon.